Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Professor of History at UNC Chapel Hill, W. Fitzhugh Brundage, author of the Pulitzer-nominated book Civilizing, Torture, an American Tradition. Fitz, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here.
So your book is both a history of torture as practiced in this country, and I guess even before it was, in fact, a country, and the mechanism in which we have told ourselves that it hasn't happened in many respects. But let's start with the earliest examples of the use of torture in colonial times, I guess. What stands out as one that is archetypal for you?
Well, I think for me, what's archetypal is an incident I talk about, an episode that happened actually in what we would now call French Canada, because it's an interesting moment when we see a European settler, in this case a Jesuit priest, involved in a dialogue with a Huron Indian about the appropriateness of torture. And the reason I think it's such a rich moment in the history of this subject is because the Jesuit priest was trying to discourage the Huron Indians from torturing an Iroquois Indian who they had captured, as was a practice in Indian warfare. And there was the North American Indians had an elaborate kind of code, if you will, a kind of etiquette about how to apply torture and how it was done, when it was done, what was expected to be the behavior of the victim of their torture as part of warfare. Well, the Hurons' response to the Jesuits is, well, you torture, right? And the Jesuit says, oh, yes, we do torture, but we only torture in these circumstances. And you can see in the brief dialogue that we have, it's not even a dialogue, the account that we have, a back and forth between the Indian trying to figure out, okay, why is our torture bad, but your torture is okay? And simultaneously the Jesuit trying to work out in his mind an argument for why Indian torture is barbaric, whereas European torture is not barbaric. So the reason I bring this up is because it's a moment when we see the Europeans being confronted with a different culture of torture and trying to figure out how they can, that is, how Europeans can persuade themselves, let alone Indians, that they are, in fact, a superior, more civilized people. And it's the working out of that, how it is that Europeans or Euro-American settlers, invaders, convince themselves that their culture of torture is somehow not antithetical to civilization, that I think is a very interesting moment in the history of the evolution of ideas about torture.
And the Huron, and you write that indigenous people here anyways, their torture was a mechanism to essentially, in some ways, sort of almost to reset a captive so they could live amongst them.
Sometimes, although sometimes it was torture to death. And I guess here's the simplest way I would describe the difference. Of course, I'm talking about if you will, the idealized notion of torture in these societies.
Right.
We can be sure that there were instances where these events didn't follow the idealized norms at all. But in European society, torture, ever since the ancient Romans, had been assumed as a means by which you could extract the truth from a human being. You could use it to force them to tell you what they would say, what would be the honest truth, because the mind could not prevent the body from telling truth. So in the European mind, there's a relationship between bodily pain and truth, whereas for North American Indians, torture was a way in which one society of Indians, one Indian nation, could convey its disdain for its enemy. And simultaneously, the victim of the torture was supposed to, through his extreme ability to absorb torture, was supposed to reflect back his disdain for his torturers. So there was a very different purpose, if you will, to the acts of torture. Now, you would say from an outsider, what's happening in both instances is a human body is being subjected to horrific forms of bodily torture. And so superficially, torture is happening to both bodies, but for very different purposes. And Europeans often found the Indian, if you will, dialogue between the torturers causing pain and the torture victim trying to mock the torment that he was suffering. They found that to be barbaric, whereas Indians found the idea of what Europeans were doing as to be incomprehensible.
And what was it? I mean, I don't want to jump too far ahead, or I want to be able to go through a couple of these sort of the developments in terms of the legal strategies and the I guess the rhetorical strategies in which to sort of allow this justification for torture. But what was it that ultimately about that European, or was there more of a sense with the European introduction of torture and what ultimately became sort of the American way of rationalizing it? Was there more a sense that there needed to be a rationalization, as in terms of like we need to be able to justify this, a unique justification for our torture, as opposed to from indigenous people who saw this as part of a part of the relationship that they had with their enemies?
Yes, I think you're spot on. That, and it's the European rationalization of torture was tied to many different concerns. One concern of the Europeans was, of course, that they were working out in their own minds, to their own satisfaction, the justifications for the kind of expropriation, invasion, decimation of American Indian societies. So part of it, you could say, is a rationalization, but it was also, I mean, there was and I'm not trying to mitigate at all this by saying that there was simultaneously an effort, so to speak, to elevate this to something more than just simply a crude land grab, which of course it was, but the rationalization, of course, was that they were going to Christianize these peoples if they could be Christianized, and of course they would also be civilized. And that was the notion somehow that the Europeans were going to be the bringers, if you will. They were going to disseminate civilization was a hugely powerful idea because it made the colonization, the invasion, something more than just simply a military act. But tied to that at the same time is that, not in the case of French Canada I was talking about before, but for many of the Protestant Europeans who were coming to what is now the United States, they also had this powerful association of torture with the Catholic Counter-Reformation, with the Inquisition, all of the stories about the dark violence of the Spanish Inquisition throughout Western Europe. And so their association with torture as well was as a kind of tyrannical, despotic act. So there was the torture that they knew in the old world that they associated with the crushing out of true faith, and as a kind of backward reactionary form of violence in their minds. And then there was the barbaric torture of Indians on the frontier. And so they were trying to carve out, if you will, a space where torture, they were not going to be engaged in the torture of the barbaric Indians as they saw them, nor were they going to replicate the torture they associated with, for example, the Spanish Inquisition.
Where does let's go into, let's move a little further on the timeline, because I'm curious as to one of the things that I find fascinating about the book, and just about the sort of the tracking of how torture has been rationalized over the past 250 years, at least in this country, is it seems to be a subset of other rationalizations, right? And I wonder, as we talk about the sort of the imperial project, I guess, of early settlers and taking indigenous people's lands, and then slavery, and all of this, there seems to be sort of a similar muscle that's being worked in terms of justifying it and establishing an other and whatnot. And I wonder, like, which comes first, the I guess the manifest destiny, and therefore when we do these things, or is it sort of has to be created in retrospect?
That is the $64 million question. And I wish I could tell you that I had a really cogent answer for that, but instead what I'll do is what I honestly think, but I have to work this out with you in conversation, and that is that I think it's not so much one came first as much as that is a kind of rationale for engaging in, for example, torture or extreme forms of violent coercion, went hand in hand and evolved simultaneous with an impulse to take advantage of circumstances. And what I mean by that is sometimes the action is driven by people who honestly are not concerned with these high questions of the morality of X or Y, or the justice of labeling Indians barbaric or not. So, for example, in the case of the so-called Paxton Boys, who were a group of central Pennsylvania Euro-Americans who massacred Conestoga Indians shortly before the American Revolution, I think that was, I can't get into the minds of those men, but I think their rationale was fairly overt, simple, outright racism against the Conestoga Indians, and in a desire to remove them from the colony as retribution for other Indian actions elsewhere. What is important about the response to them is then how people who were not present at the massacre, weren't responsible for the massacre, then made sense of it. So I guess that's part of what I would emphasize here, that there are actions on the ground that may be motivated by all of the crass and or complicated motivations that any human may have. But then when the larger society discusses their actions and comes up with a rationale for it, I think the ways in which that rationale are laid out is a very important part of the story.
So there's almost like concentric circles of the need for rationale maybe it increases as you get a little further away from the actual action itself, from actually perpetrating the action, because it becomes a reflection on your society at large.
Yeah, I think that's very well put, and it especially becomes important for those people who are in positions of authority or positions of influence who are trying to articulate whatever the mission of this society is, whether it's in the case of someone like Benjamin Franklin, he's trying to elevate. He was a critic, a savage, or I should use that word, a very stern critic of the Paxton Boys, very eloquent. In his case, he's somehow trying to speak to other Americans, by which I mean other colonial Euro-Americans, as well as back to England and to Europe, to reassure people that, yes, we can create a civilization here. We are not going to be savages.
And then as you get into the 1800s, you have, I guess, differing contexts for which torture and this type of physical and mental punishment is justified. In the context of prisons, it's perceived as rehabilitative.
Yes, and I think one of the important points about that notion of somehow physical coercion can be part of rehabilitation is that it sets up a logic which is an incredibly powerful logic which persists in the imagination, the American imagination to the present day. And that is sometimes we need to physically coerce people to do what's in their best interest, even if that means we have to do things that may appear to some of us as equivalent to torture. And they were perceived to be equivalent to torture in that era, whether it was 24/7 isolation, which they tried at the turn of the 19th century. And they discovered very quickly that it had very severe mental health consequences. But nevertheless, they rationalized that, well, that was what was necessary in order to produce the appropriate introspection on the part of prisoners so that they came to recognize their wrong ways and corrected their behavior. In other instances, there was the idea that, well, nothing will get through the mind of a hardened criminal other than physical violence, and so you have to use violence to compel a prisoner to act the way society wants him to act because he otherwise won't act that way. So in either case, you can come up with a justification for physical coercion. And the interesting issue is that those who advocated direct violence to the body through flogging and through something that was called the water shower, which is sort of like a 19th century version of waterboarding, those folks justified that by saying that only physical pain would compel proper behavior. Others who came up with forms of what we might call mental torture that didn't involve physical pain per se, claimed that physical pain was barbaric and that their methods, such as isolation 24/7 from any contact with people, were more humane. So in that case, you can see whichever tactic you chose, you could make the argument it was preferable.
How did that contrast with the perspective of physical and punishment and I guess mental to a certain extent of slaves? I mean, was there even that level of rationale, or was it just simply it's my property? I can do what I want.
Well, yes, you're certainly right about that. First off, that's the idea that slaves are my property was not only was it a legal position, a legal tenet, but it was also if you will, a kind of practical, widespread belief that slaves were really beyond the conscience, so to speak, of other humans. We didn't have, that is, we who were not enslaved had no obligation per se to be concerned about the plight of slaves. Now, of course, that idea began to break down in the late 18th century as a result of the American Revolution and other influences, but it was still a very powerful idea and a legal principle through until the time of the Civil War. And so I think one of the really enormous challenges for opponents of slavery, abolitionists, was to somehow convince Americans that in fact it was possible to torture a slave. And it seems self-evident perhaps to us today that that would be the case. The enslaved were human beings. But if you start from the premise that in fact the enslaved are a baser form of humanity, whether you believe that on the basis of racism, or you believe that on the basis of some idea that somehow Africans are a more primitive form of human beings, all of the rationales that white Americans came up with, you could then justify the idea that, well, somehow the enslaved don't feel pain the way we do, or the enslaved are so primitive that we have to use these methods, or they are enslaved so they have no rights that we are obligated to recognize, which is pretty close to what the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision in 1858. So for the challenge for especially African American abolitionists, I think, was to establish at a very fundamental level that they were human beings who suffered pain and had a conscience that could be tormented the same way white Americans suffered pain.
And my sense is that the following the war and the story of Andersonville, because what's interesting about this story to me is it seems that prior to this time, at least in terms of broad-based American psyche, right, that people who are tortured are either not people, as you've talked about with the slaves, or are a special class of people who have, broken the law and are outside of like sort of normal societal bounds or something like this. But in the context of Andersonville, it seems like that desire to, I guess, not have to confront what lives within our society is somehow really that muscle started to really flex.
Yes, I think you're right, and that, I think one of the extraordinary acts of, I'll call it erasure, of historical erasure or amnesia, is about American Civil War prison camps. And we could argue endlessly, as many people have, those who are interested in this topic, and there haven't been that many actually. We could argue endlessly about whether Confederate prisoner of war camps were worse than Union prisoner of war camps, or whether Union officers or Union administrators wanted to treat Confederate prisoners cruelly, or vice versa. We can argue that all we want, but what we lose sight of, or have lost the sort of collective memory of, is that there was enormous suffering during the American Civil War in prisoner of war camps, and both white Northerners and black Northerners, and I should say white Northerners, black Northerners, and white Southerners believed that there was rampant intentional cruelty in these camps. And if there wasn't, there was intentional cruelty on some occasions, but even apologists would acknowledge that there was horrific conditions in these camps. And the curious thing is, we don't recognize that this was a moment in time when the, if you will, the kind of veil was pulled back, and white Americans in particular could have seen that we white Americans, are capable of doing extraordinarily, or allowing extraordinary hardship and cruelty to other whites. And that was a moment in time that Americans could have, in essence, looked at themselves in the mirror. I mean, there were other times when they could have as well, but they could not have escaped that it was white Americans who allowed this to happen, or did this to other white Americans.
What's interesting too about Andersonville, like on one hand, one would think like, okay, well, the reason why we don't hear stories of how Confederate soldiers were essentially subjected to what was tantamount to torture is because the Union Army won and they get to write the history. But Andersonville is the opposite, where Union soldiers were treated to what amounted to torture. And on one hand, I can understand, like, okay, I can see the President Lincoln or Union Army officials saying we're not going to make a big deal of this because we need to heal the country at this point. But it also is remarkable. There is at the very least, even if that's the reason why it's being done, I I feel like on some level we're haunted by this notion of turn the page, right? Because that's literally, 150 years later, that's what President Obama is saying about our torture program in Iraq.
Yes, yes. And the people who are responsible for turning the page are sometimes, exactly as you said, the people you would expect to be responsible. I mean, again, not to mitigate what turning the page meant, but one can understand that after a civil war of the magnitude and of the bloodshed of the American Civil War, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to stitch this nation together? You have to make some decisions on the fly of what you're going to talk about, what you're going to focus attention on. And one can understand why some people would decide that, well, in the interest of national reconciliation, there's certain things we're just not going to dwell on. Like, for example, the treatment of Union prisoners by Confederates. But there are others who participated, and I won't get in the weeds long here, but just to say that, for example, you probably didn't immediately think to yourself that, well, professional historians played a role in this amnesia about prison camps. But they did. In the early 20th century into the mid-20th century, professional historians played a large role in discounting any evidence of the full horror of the prison camps and offering excuses for them. And that was driven by impulses partially internal to the historical profession, but it was also driven by that broader interest of white northern historians and white southern historians finding some sort of common ground where they could agree on terms about the Civil War. And in the process, they decided, if you will, much like the national leaders, that, well, let's just not make a big issue out of the Civil War prison camps.